So thank you so much, by the way, JJ, for taking the time to be here. I'm gonna basically, by the way, my name is Prakash. I'm one of the co-organizers along with Dan and Brittany here on the Santa Barbara User Experience Meetup group. And I'm gonna give a little bit of an introduction to JJ, and we're gonna talk for probably like 30 to 40 minutes. And then we're gonna leave some time for Q&A afterwards. And then we'll wrap up. Okay, sound good? All right, so for those of you that don't know, I have a little intro spiel here for you. JJ has over 20 years of experience as a designer and product strategist, and she's the head of customer experience for real estate here at AppFolio, where she leads a team of designers and researchers who are passionate about creating excellent customer interactions. And I just learned recently that your, I guess, team spirit animal is a unicorn, yes, which is amazing. I think that's awesome. And you started that when you joined here, right? Awesome. Beyond that, she also happens to be one of the founding members of this Santa Barbara User Experience Meetup group, which boasts nearly 750 members. I'm not sure where they are tonight, but and over 160 events. So quite accomplished. And I'm excited to sit here with JJ and learn lots more about her. So I think I want to start with how you got into UX, because most of the people that I know who are in design or research come from a background in human-computer interaction, but you have a degree in commercial photography. So why don't we start there, and maybe you talk a little bit about how you went from commercial photography and got into UX.
Yep, it's a really great question. So my passion was always photography. It actually took me a long time to go to college because no one told me that I didn't have to decide that day what I want to be when I grew up. So I was 23 when I went to college, and I went to Brooks to do photography. And in the midst of that, one of the aspects of photography I was really interested in was editorial. And I took a class where if you're going to take photographs for a magazine, for example, you have to think about where the masthead is going to be, where they're going to put copy. And so it just was like a no-brainer that I should also do some graphic design classes so that I can understand how typography works and how it would play with images. And in doing so, I got a certificate at like the UCSB extension, but they had classes in like web design and all these things. So when I graduated from Brooks, I didn't want to leave Santa Barbara, so commercial photography was a little bit out the window. But so I landed in print design, but had already dabbled in like web design, and then I somehow landed a job as a web graphic designer. So this is like long before people knew what UX was. And it's kind of the rest is history. They hired me to do graphic design for websites. And I remember my first week there going through every single web flow and doing what I know now is like a heuristic analysis, but that's like was natural to me to go through all the click funnels and go through their conversion paths and find out like where users might get stuck and provide some feedback on that. And was self-taught, so I read a lot of books, learned about things like usability testing as functions that we could use to improve. That business was all about conversion and looking at conversion rates, and so just kind of grew from there and realized that what I've been doing all along was this UX thing that everybody's talking about.
So was your when did you make the switch from web designer that was learning all of these things about usability, so on and so forth, to getting your first official user experience role? When did that happen?
That's a really good question. So at that company, I actually, there can be a fine line between UX and product management. So I actually held the title, I was creative director before I was UX anything. And then I went from creative director to director of product, and then had both. I did have you at that point, I think we called her an information architect, report into me, as well as product managers. And then Kian knows who. And then when from there, I went to lynda.com and was a senior product manager. But even there, before, they hadn't really built out their product management practice, so it was kind of a hybrid. So I actually, the first time I had UX in my title was here. And no one's ever asked me that question, but it's so funny to think about that. I'd been doing it all along. Even as a product manager at Lynda, mostly what I was doing was wireframe and speccing, right? But yeah, I had senior interaction designer was my first title 8 years ago here at AppFolio.
Okay, so 8 years ago at AppFolio, 2010, you were the first person to be hired in this interaction or user experience role. Um, that must have been an interesting experience. Like, I'm really curious, like, who hired you in and what were your responsibilities and how did that feel?
Let me try using
Oh,
this. That way we can
that's
each
cool.
have our, I'm going to speak really.
Everyone try not to laugh.
Yeah. We'll see if this works. Okay. Hello? Yes, it works. Hi. Okay. So, who hired me? At the time, Jason Randall was our VP of product. He's now our CEO. So that's been a fun career to watch as well. Um, I was at another company when someone reached out to me and said, "Hey, Jason's looking for UX designer. Would you be interested, or would you mind talking to him?" And I remember meeting Jason for coffee with zero intention of applying because I was on the product management path. I did not want to be in UX. Reason being that I had done enough agile transformations to make me like my head spin, and I didn't like UX in I can retrospectively look back and say I didn't like UX in waterfall environments, um, because there was no collaboration. Like I knew that whatever I was coming up with like wasn't right, and I needed collaborate. And you didn't really get that in waterfall environments. So I was definitely not interested in UX. And when I met Jason for coffee, however, by the end of that, I was like super on board because what I didn't realize about Appfolio, the key differentiator was that we've been an agile shop since the very beginning. So my role then became not, come here and do stuff that UX does and deliver wireframes. It was like, come figure out how UX fits into our agile environment. In an environment where ease of use is already our key competitive advantage for our product. And by the way, we're hiring a UX designer for the first time. Like that was an interesting challenge. So it wasn't, what he said to me is like, we don't really know what you do, but we know we need you. But it wasn't like, come in and we expect that day one you're going to deliver wireframes and tell the engineers what to build. It's like you got to come in and figure out how to keep ease of use uh, as a competitive advantage while also engaging the team who got us this far, right? And that's what was really interesting about it. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. And this kind of segues naturally into the talk that you just gave at Enterprise UX. And what I'll do is I'll send the link to everyone if you haven't seen it. It's very good. But JJ did a talk on the UX maturity model, which is basically how an organization recognizes user experience. So when you started in 2010, basically at the bottom of that ladder is being unrecognized. Like your boss was like, we think we need you, we don't know why, but I guess maybe it's above unrecognized, yes, one step above, yeah. And then finally now to being embedded. So maybe talk a little bit about that, because you were given a lot of responsibility, and part of your role was to kind of figure that out, right, and climb that ladder. So talk a little about it.
And the ladder is good to look at it retrospectively. I wish I had it at the beginning.
Right.
I can reflect back on it. So without having the image available right in this second, but there's the maturity model. There's many different versions of it. You can Google UX maturity model. There's one that I use in my talk, which has like 6 rungs. So it goes from unrecognized, meaning like there's zero investment in UX. So obviously, if any of us are working in design, we're at least at rung 2 because it's recognized you're there. And then it goes, I think 6 is embedded, which means it's like part of the fabric of the organization. It's not just, you're doing wireframes, but it's like it's talked about, executives are involved, everybody sees experience, design as an important function. So I will say that when I started at AppFolio, it was definitely rung 2, which I think is invested. It's like, okay, yeah, we get it, but like, we'll see. But when we talk about the UX team, we used to get together once a year and go through like how we've climbed that ladder. But we've always had 2 arrows. It was like, okay, year 1, we were here. But the second arrow was like where the business actually aspired to be. And I think that's really important because AppFolio, that was one of the ways we got really lucky, as we've always had executive sponsors. So there was always this element of embedded, or it was one below, I think, where there was just like, we need to figure out how to make this a key competitive, like, or just like instill this across everything we're doing, but we're not there yet. Yeah. And so that helped climb that ladder because we knew what the business was aspiring to. I think in practice, I think the business is like, we're already here. And so my role really became helping them understand that like you actually we're not here. And some of the key things that changed from where they went, they thought, oh, we're here because we hired a UX designer, is like, hey, your guess that we were going to have one UX designer to every 6 teams might have been a little bit under-resourced, right? So now UX, for example, right now UX scales at the same rate as product management, which is like 1 to 1.5 teams, which is awesome. Like we need those. Other indications are where UX sits in the strategic conversations. So there was this huge belief that we're product, we will come up with the problem, and then you will be part of the solution space with engineers, which is totally true and totally valid. But what we learn, not only us and engineers too, and this is something that we kind of championed in some ways, is that while we're solving problems, we identify new potential problems to solve. And so we had 1 year as we were climbing maturity that our challenge was actually to feed those tactical insights back into the business to get more into the strategic early on conversations. So those are just a couple examples of how we climb that.
Yeah, and I think your process in doing so, there's 2 things that stuck out to me when you gave the talk. One was the importance of building empathy with the engineers specifically that you're working with, and then the stakeholders and basically everyone that you're championing the user experience, I guess, roll through. And then the second thing that you said was the importance of understanding how to speak the business language and building a business case for the designs that you were putting together. So can you talk a little bit about those 2 facets of how you built, I guess, or you climbed the maturity ladder, and maybe some of the challenges you faced along the way and how you solved them?
Sure. So on the empathy piece, it's really, you'll see this in my talk. At every stage, there is an investment in relationships, and it's probably the most important before you put any pixel on a screen or line on a paper. It's like, who are you going to align to? Who's your internal champions? Who are your partners? So I really emphasize, like, especially if you're coming in as a UX designer, it's a no-brainer to me that it's going to be your engineers. Obviously, your product managers, it will depend on your organization about who you prioritize. But here, we're very engineering centered. Engineers take a lot of ownership. They love our customers. They care about our customers. Reason number 273 why I wanted to join AppFolio. And so empathizing with them and becoming partners with them was more important than a wireframe I could have handed to them. And so some ways that I did that is simply like collaborative whiteboarding, introducing them to the process. I'm a big advocate. I think in UX we don't do as much like flow diagramming as we used to do. And I think one big benefit of doing that, especially when you're working with engineers, is that that's kind of the language they think of in terms of system think. So anytime you can like understand the visual language that they use to actually even architect backend systems, you're sort of speaking the same language. So that's part of it on the relationship building piece. On the business case piece, I think that has been far more recent. And so you gave me 2 examples, which is like relationships with engineers. That's something like we started years ago, and it's a constant thing. But
Sure.
I think we know what to do. But the business case piece becomes more and more important especially as a business matures. So our story is not only that we matured UX, but we were maturing UX in a maturing business. And so AppFolio is way more data driven than we were 8 years ago. And 8 years ago, it was kind of good enough to be like, customers are asking for this. We should totally make them happy and delight them. And like, yeah, okay, let's do that. And you do build measure, you do lean style, and you're like, yay, customer value. And now what you're really trying to understand is like, customer value absolutely matters, but there's a million things we can do.
Yeah.
How do we tie those things to business value? And this comes up in UX specifically around UX debt, especially when you've worked for a matured or maturing company, where you're like, we should go and fix this workflow. And I'm not going to say we figured that out. I think it's for designers especially, it's hard. It's like, why? You need to be able to say why. What is the business outcome? It's totally fine and good. We want to do great things for customers and always advocate why it's great for the customer, but we need to be able to tie customer value to business dollars wherever possible. And I think that is a key um, discipline that any designer, it would just behoove you to learn that, read books. We had designers on our team read a book in a book club called Financial Intelligence. Like anything that you can do to align your thinking to like even how a product manager thinks, so that you can then advocate for usability issues in that same mindset. It's just going to help boost your career and help you be heard and actually allow you to deliver great experiences to your customers.
Yeah, I love the way that you said that. And oftentimes when certainly people hear the word designer, you think of someone that's putting pixels on a screen, but it is so much more than that, isn't it? So I want to talk a little bit about your transition as you were climbing this ladder of the UX maturity model within AppFolio. You went from director of user experience to your current role, which is the head of customer experience. So, I'm sure a lot of people have heard of CX before, but maybe talk a little bit about what you see the differences are between the two.
Yeah. So I would say that transition started about 4 years ago with, like every year or so I pick a battle. It's what I call trailblazing, like, let's do something better. And my battle I picked about 4 years ago is, the user's experience doesn't start and end in the software.
What?
We have a whole service organization and we're trying to solve software problems or solve problems with our software, but there's this whole element of like, if whatever we build isn't intuitive or like doesn't solve the problem, they're going to kick over to this whole other department that we're completely siloed from. And that message resonated, just that message alone, like it was pretty easy to get executive champions.
Right.
See, like, that's a really good point. Like, what do you suggest? And I had done, this is like my self-learned stuff, self-taught. I go to conferences and take like one journey mapping workshop, and I'm like a pro now. And I'm like, let's all literally, I got one executive to say like, yeah, I'll sponsor that. And then she helped me get executives from across the business. And I hosted my very first journey mapping workshop with VPs, which was kind of crazy. Wow. In retrospect. Like, we've definitely iterated on our process of doing that, but the value is super seen. And like the maturity of CX at that point is what we're talking about is end-to-end experience. And I think what surprised even me in that activity, especially when you're working with VPs who you expect to know everything about, you just expect everybody knows the end-to-end experience. And when we all came together and workshopped that, there were so many aha moments that we all look back, I'm like, I can't believe you, like, do you guys talk to each other? Do you even know this is how this works? And so that was just like high level journey mapping. And that has evolved to, hey, JJ, can you like just look at onboarding and, do some research and figure out, how can we improve our onboarding process? And so I did this was 2 years ago, where I just spent, it was like a little over a month, and I followed every customer interaction from the day they signed. I was on the call when they signed the contract, and on the call when they got like high five, like you're ready to start using the product, and all the interactions in between, mapped those very specifically in like a service blueprint style, which you can look up. I won't go too much into it, but like blueprint every single interaction, every single touch point. And again, go back up to VPs, and I'm like, well, this is the experience. And people were like,
eye-opening, isn't it?
Like so in 36 days, there was something like 110 touches, and they interacted with 10 different entities, like people across the business. And it was, so that's kind of like, I talk about CX now as its own little maturity model of understanding what the power of what you can do. So it's, to me, it's still, for me, it's been an evolution from design, because user and customer experience are so, I would say user experience is usually right about the product and customers end to end. But what I've found more often is people come into CX from very different backgrounds. So I'm excited being a designer coming in from that perspective.
Absolutely. And one thing that I love that you do is you assign mission statements to each one of the teams. So and correct me if I'm wrong, but for UX, your mission statement for the team is to tirelessly advocate for our customer. And for CX, it's accelerate customer value through design and delivery of exceptional end-to-end experience. Is that right?
I would say the second. I would say that the mission, the second one is a mission statement for both UX. Like I think of CX, UX is part of CX.
Got it.
Right.
Yeah.
So we've been one team, and so the mission statement is accelerating value.
Okay.
And that's value to the customer, which also equates to value to the business. Then there's the tireless advocates for the customer is like, I would call that like a guiding principle.
Okay.
This is how we do that, and
Yeah.
like that we will operate in this way.
Yeah.
You can read that. There's also on those guiding principles, you'll see CX team. This is our like team brand, and you can go visit with like, again, it's like how we approach our work. What's our values, kind of, and so I'd say the tireless advocate fits into our values.
That's fantastic. And I really think that it's important, just as designers and researchers, people in UX, to have that true north, right? That we all can kind of be beating on the same drum and we know the reasons why we're doing what we're doing. So it's really good that you have that established. I want to segue a little bit. Interestingly enough, at the same time as you were climbing the ladder of the UX maturity model within AppFolio, you also started to do it outside of AppFolio in this Santa Barbara user experience meetup group. So I'm curious as to why you decided that you needed to get involved in Santa Barbara UX meetup, and what it was like when you got started.
Yeah, I kind of took over I wasn't the original founder. Actually, Kristen was one of the original founders of SBUX. Everybody, Kristen. And there was a shift in what Kristen was doing, and Kijun also ran it. And I was super interested in growing a community around user experience. This is Santa Barbara. It's super small. And I really liked the idea of not only growing the community of designers, that's really valuable, but I'm on a mission to share design and spread design wherever I can. And so to start locally, that's what really motivates me and has motivated me about this group is like I said, I'm a designer. I think design is really important. I want to advocate for that and teach others how to think like that and show others how design factors into their role, even if their role isn't design specific.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It seems like there's obviously been a lot of events that have happened. Can you talk to or highlight maybe some of your favorites and ones that you felt were the most impactful?
Yeah, let me close this window before I do that. Drive me crazy. Okay. So my favorite events, I think my favorite events have been ones that were hands-on and kind of workshop style. We used to do this, like go to a conference and kind of learn a technique, and then people would come and share that technique with the group. Right. Those ones are really engaging. Some people don't love workshopping though, so you don't want to do that all the time. But I think those have been really great. I think anything, I know that I wasn't able to make it, but I know there was a mentor night last week, and we've done things like portfolio reviews or resume reviews. Anything that involves getting experienced people with less experienced people is probably one of the most valuable things we can do in this group that I think are really engaging, that I really enjoy. And then the third ones are one that stands out, for example, is like when Mark Trammell was at Sonos for a brief period of time, and he was already kind of on the conference circuit and had these great stories to tell, and then we brought him in and he's like, now he's local Santa Barbara. I don't know if you know who Mark Trammell was, but he used to be at Twitter, and so it's like it's cool to have people that have been speakers that are in Santa Barbara that then can share their craft and be a part of those too.
Right. So, yeah. And that must be really exciting for people to have someone like from Twitter to come down to little Santa Barbara.
Yeah, it's pretty exciting.
Yeah. So. How have you seen the UX community evolve here? Because, in 2010, it seems like it was UX. I mean, I think just everywhere was just something that was just becoming a recognized profession. And I would say even more so here, probably in this micro community. And I'm just curious, from 2010 onwards, or when you got involved in Santa Barbara UX, how have you seen that change?
Yeah, I can't say how or why. I can just say that I've seen it change. Okay. And I've seen it change in the type of events that people are attracted to. And we've talked about this, there's a ton of different events, and I've seen on audience sizes grow and shrink over time. And so I think that's what's mostly interesting. I think what stayed the same is a ton of people looking to get into design, and I think that's really important. I think what I've seen more of and that I get excited about in terms of more people joining, different kind of walks of life joining, is more people from outside. Like when we have startup founders that are coming here to learn about UX, I'm like, yes, when you've got engineers that are just like, and you see this when people join the group, it's like we ask them, why did you join? My favorite is like, I'm an engineer and I work with designers and I want to understand how to work with them. And
it's
I'm
amazing.
Like, I love you.
Yeah.
So I think like membership has changed. The core group that shows up every time sort of like has done this in an interesting way. I think part of it too is it's Santa Barbara, so people can be sometimes transient in and out,
Right.
So it's been interesting.
Yeah. You touched on people wanting or interested in getting into user experience, and one of the things in the questionnaire, I'm not sure if we had, I think, more votes than there are people here, so I think I think maybe they'll watch this later. But what advice would you have for people that are trying to break into user experience? Like, how should they get started?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. It's a question that I get a lot, and it can be difficult to answer. But my answer is always like you've got to show what you can do. I had never went to any sort of my degrees in photography, and this has been my career path. So, as someone who has hired many, many designers, your degree in UX is less interesting to me, and I think that's probably changing over time. But you know, UX degrees are fairly new, and so I'm kind of like, I don't really know that you can take anybody and churn out a designer, because I think design is more aptitude than it is skill. Definitely some of those things can be taught, but I think there's other things that are just like, how do you think? So I think paying attention to what it means to be a designer. When we say systems think, does that resonate with you? Like, so the first step is like, make sure this is the role that that you're really interested in, that's going to spark your fire. I've had my fair share of designers wanting to break into it. And when you sit and talk to them, it's because they think this is how they get their foot in the door to be on a product team, and it's the easiest job you can have, and like it's the most hireable job. And I'm like, yeah,
You got news.
That's adorable. No. Or like, I think I want to be a UX designer because I think that's going to be a foray into being a product manager. And it's like, this is unique. So I think understand what UX design is first. I think the second thing is you've got to be able to show that you have the aptitude. And so, I did this through taking classes or whatever, and I like every once in a while I'll still take a class, and then you get these like assignments, you get these outputs, and so you go somewhere. I actually mentored someone once, and I've offered this to many people, and only one person took me up on it and never followed through, which is like, I'll give you a project, and I'll give you the steps to actually do the project, and then you can come back to me, like we'll just do a mini class, and then you can come back to me with like your assignments and we can talk about them. And that takes work. And so very few people actually, almost no one has really taken me up on that.
That is amazing.
Which is what, like, you want to show a portfolio. I was telling Kristen that we hired a designer a year ago, Clayton, who was one of our organizers here. And he was basically in customer support, and was like many people in our customer support org, who I'm all like, anybody at AppFolio reaches out and says, hey, I want to get in design, I'm like, great, let's have coffee. And he was one of those people. And the difference was he was super hungry. And so after we had coffee, he's like, yeah, I looked at this thing and I read this article and these are my thoughts on it. And I'm getting all these, like, he's doing things that other people probably aren't doing because they think they're bugging me, but I loved it. He's like, hey, do you have a login to Axure so I can learn it? Like, I want to do all this. Like, what other tools can you give me that I can just use without having to buy it? And so he just like went after it. He came to this events. He came to every event. We offered, like we always do, like, hey, do you want to come shadow our team? And he was like, went and asked his manager and got on board that week to do that. Right.
Awesome.
So I think it's the aptitude, understand what it is, know you have the aptitude, and then just the hunger to go get after it.
Yeah. So if someone, let's say, is wanting to get a job at AppFolio and they don't have a lot of experience under their belt at other companies, what I'm hearing you say is that you need to be able to demonstrate it in one way or another.
Yes.
And so whether that be taking a class or maybe even fixing a problem that you see in the products that you use every day and then demonstrating that to you, that's a way to do it too, right?
That's the assignment I give.
Yeah.
So I'm like, go find an experience that you think really sucks, and then come back and let's talk about it.
Right.
Or do some reading or do whatever so that you can learn the tools. And I think the other thing is like squeaky wheel. You want to get into it, and like reaching out to me or Amy or anybody like AppFolio, reaching out to me one time and having one coffee is not going to get you a job, right? So it's like, how do you stay in touch with that? How do you, I have, there's been a few people that are like, I want a mentor, will you be my mentor? And I'm like, I'll try, but like I love the tenacity of that. It might be, that's me personally. That might be different for other people, but yeah, the hunger and tenacity is a big, big part of it.
All right. Well, we are at time. That flew by. And I just wanted to give the opportunity to the audience to ask any questions that you had using this ridiculous microphone that
You
JJ
can hug
has
the box
concocted.
like I've been doing. I love that we're recording this and I'm like, hi, microphone.
It's like the perfect AppFolio sponsor picture. Does anyone have any questions for JJ? Here, I can pass it here.
I'll answer with this. I was just gonna throw it and hopefully not hit anybody's head. All right.
So, you mentioned that you're a systems thinker primarily, and maybe not everyone here has heard what that really means. So, in terms of the kinds of thinking that you're doing, can you explain a little bit more about what systems thinking means to you and how that might be different than how other people might approach a problem?
Yeah, that's a really good question. How do I define systems thinking? I think it goes back when I talk about like I don't think designers do enough flowcharts. That's like the simplest way I can think of it is like if you've got a problem, there's like when you're looking at a problem, how do you break that problem down? And I see everything everywhere I look. It's like beautiful mind. Everything is a design problem. Like I feel like I'm crazy. But if, for example, the business is trying to figure out how to get teams to collaborate with each other. This is an actual problem. And they're like talking to people and they're scratching their heads. And I'm like, hey, let's go and like actually flowchart how they interact today. Like this is what I mean by systems. So it's like what's the before state and then what's the after state? How does it exist today? This is kind of how journey mapping works. And then what's the desired state? So how are you going to map that out and how are you going to think through things in a more process oriented way as opposed to, and I think a lot of design, I don't think all design, like visual designers, I think tend to be not system thinkers. They're more like graphic designers because they have that more creative brain of like, let's just throw a bunch of spaghetti in the wall and like see what's most beautiful. I don't know if that if you understand the kind of the differences that there, I don't know. It's kind of hard to explain. That's a really good question, but hopefully that answers it.
Ridiculous cute. Hey, so as you were growing the team here at AppFolio, how did you kind of make the argument for continued resourcing? Like, oh, we need to add more people doing research, or we need to add more designers. Like, how did you present that argument other than it's really important?
Yeah, so that comes down, this is why building relationships are really important. So the best arguments are the ones that you're not making yourself. My best situation is when an engineer says, we need more than one designer for every 6 teams. So that you build those relationships, you find who's your internal customer, and like when you look, so it's just proven through value, right? And so what that does mean, especially in the trailblazing kind of side of what I do, CX, for example. Like, yeah, I stood up and like, hey, we should do CX, but I had to actually work some extra hours and do some things to hack it. Like what's the smallest thing I could do to try something to see if it has value and then iterate. And so everything that we've done on the maturity model has been like, we're going to just try this thing and see if it sticks, and we'll know that it's successful when people start asking for that. Research is a really great example. When I hired my first researcher, I had in my head what a researcher would do, and I just went to my boss. I'm like, I think we need a researcher, and that worked. And it turns out what I thought this researcher needed to do, nobody actually saw the value. There was a huge, we pivoted crazy on like what researchers ended up doing. And it wasn't until afterwards that I was like, duh, like I didn't talk to a single engineering leader when I thought up like why we needed, when I saw that they recognized the need. And so once we started involving them, it was like, what do you need from a researcher? And that's actually what evolved that role. Does that help?
Mhm.
Any other questions, Sid?
So you did speak about sharing responsibilities, like or distributing responsibilities between product managers and UX. Like there's a fine line between the two. How have you seen like AppFolio grow from like a fairly small size company to where it is now? Like how have things transitioned? Like how do you like distribute responsibilities, or like who's the signing off? Who does the signing off for the design part? Is it like completely the UX, or how does that dynamic work?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There's tons of models of that, and I'll just tell you how it works at AppFolio. Because we are very engineering. Our founders are both computer science professors. So we have a very engineering centric culture. So you have to understand that that's the foundation that you come into. So engineers not run the show, but they've always been like at the center of everything for really good reason. We also hire amazing engineers that didn't need a product manager or a UX designer to build our first product. Okay. So how that has evolved, I mentioned when I came in, one of the things that my boss said at the time is like, hey, you'll be kind of a consultant, but engineers own usability. Literally, we told engineers, you own usability, right? And product managers owned the problem space. So I used to be in grooming meetings back in the early day where the product manager would read, the groomings went like this, product manager would read the story out loud, and then the engineers would talk about how to solve it, and the product manager would be like doing something else, like because he wasn't in the solution space, right? He was in the problem space, solution space, and then this like consultant space. About 3 years into it, we just started championing. It was like, this doesn't make sense to have one role own usability or one role own the problem. Like all these things started bubbling up, and so we did actually a really like I would call it a campaign. We were the engineering team. We successfully renamed us. Like I don't know if anybody recognizes this or who's here. We call ourselves the product development team now and we made T-shirts and buttons about all one team, which is like the three-legged stool, right? So it's like we actually all own usability. It's owned by the team. We all own the problem space. It's owned by the team, and we all own the solution. Like we need the product manager to weigh in on the solution because you have so much to offer there. That's been really powerful, almost to a fault. Now you have teams that like product manager will be like, here's the next problem we're solving. And I have seen engineers kick it out because they didn't make enough business case, which is but that's kind of awesome, right? It's also kind of awesome. So I've seen a huge evolution there, moving from this idea of who owns what to sharing responsibilities. And on the UX and product side, one thing I'll add to that is part of that we have really championed, and we hire UX designers that can think like product managers. And that what that means in that relationship, we have these great teams and pairs where like the product manager might go on vacation and the UX designer can actually step in and do that role, and vice versa. Like UX designer is on vacation and the product manager is running usability tests. So we try to be attached to the hip on that way.
Oh yeah. You mentioned books to read. Do you have a favorite UX book?
Well, I mean, like, so if you're getting into UX, Don't Make Me Think is like the no-brainer go-to. I don't know if you've heard of that one. I actually haven't read it, but I know so I can't. I recommend it based on what I've heard, but I haven't read the Inmates Are Running the Asylum. But I know that that's another really good one. I think it's a lot more heady, but just really brilliant when you think about product design is Don Norman's The Design of Everyday Things. It's just a go-to. He talks about mostly physical design, although he's revamped it for more digital too. So I think there's tons of other books, I think, but those are some of the key books to get started. And then I think just in terms of resources, Nielsen Norman Group is just like this smorgasbord of all things you want to learn at all different levels. UX.
Cool. Nice.
Sure. And if you reach out to me, I actually have a reading list that I'm happy to share. Yeah.
Anyone else? All right.
Great.
Great questions. Okay, cool. Well, I mean, I think that does it. JJ, I just want to recognize you for just being such an impactful leader, a UX leader in this community. I think that the fact that you've been taken AppFolio from basically just yourself to this, how many are you now?
Yeah, so there's what is it, 26 people on the design and research team?
Yeah, that's no small undertaking.
Yeah, it's
and climbing that UX maturity ladder, I imagine, took quite a lot of patience, because when you're in it, you don't even realize you're climbing the ladder. And I think that's something for all of us to learn, that when you are within your organization working in a UX capacity, they're going to view your role differently. Like, some organizations are going to be massive champions of user experience, but some, it's going to take some time, just like it did for you. And so I think, building that empathy, as you talked about, and being able to state the business case to the stakeholders, they're very important things that I think we've taken away from you. So thank you so much, JJ, and thanks for building the group to what it is today. And
Thanks for fearlessly taking over, Prakash.
Sure. No problem, JJ.
Yeah.
Hopefully, big shoes to fill.
Yeah. Well, thanks. Thanks, you guys.
Cool.
Great. Awesome.
All right. And your computer didn't die.
It didn't.
That'll be good. So can you send me that recording? 'Cause I think people